So I'm Mario Cirillo, Chief Technology Officer here at Kerv Transform, and I'm joined by my colleague Heiko, who is one of our senior solution architects, and he'll be taking you through the content of the webinar today. For those of you who don't know who Kerv are, we're a managed service provider, and we're doing something a little bit different in the marketplace. We've structured our business into specific technology practices, giving our clients the opportunity to, rather than work with a large organization that's very much a jack of all trade, we give you the opportunity to work with dedicated, almost specialized businesses that are experts in the area that they work in. So we have Kerv Collaboration and Compliance Practice, which is our sort of Microsoft Teams and telephony division. Kerv Digital, which is everything DevOps and Microsoft Dynamics, so very much taking your legacy traditional applications and helping you transform them into cloud native apps. Kerv Experience, which is our Microsoft Teams practice, so we have our own in-house Microsoft Teams contact center solution, and we developed that through our Kerv Experience division. Kerv Transform, which is where myself and Heiko are from. We are everything Microsoft and cloud and desktop. So we essentially take our customers on that journey from traditional on-premise into the cloud with a real focus on end user experience. We've got Kerv Connect, which is the name says it all. It's our networking division. And finally, Kerv Consult, which is our consultancy practice, very much focused on taking you through things like ISO 27001, Cyber Essentials, CISO as a service, those more consultative services. We'll move on. Obviously, today's webinar is focused on Microsoft Azure and, more importantly, cost control. As a managed service provider, part of our responsibility is to ensure that the platforms we build for our clients and that we manage for our clients, we are also maintaining that cost control. And Heiko is going to take you through today some of the key techniques and things to look for in order to save from your current Azure environment, but also make sure you've got the visibility and control of those costs. As part of the webinar today, for everybody that's joined, we are offering 2 exercises free of charge. One of them is our Azure Health Check Lite package, which will be run by one of our solution architects. We'll take a very high level view of your Microsoft Azure environment. We'll make any recommendations, quick wins, but also we will analyze as part of what we discussed today from a cost control perspective, any areas where we feel that you would benefit from some of the techniques that we've talked about today. So reserved instances, right sizing some of your infrastructure, maybe leveraging power management to really drive those costs down. And also, in addition to, obviously we're talking about Azure as the primary, but there's 365 as well. So we're offering 365 optimization workshops, again, free of charge, which are really designed to sit down with you and your team and look at, are you on the correct licensing for 365? Is it the most efficient way of leveraging the product? Are there areas that you're paying for that you're not making use of? Are there other sort of solutions and products within your infrastructure that you could have a cost saving by displacing for some of the features within 365? So when we get to the end of the webinar, there'll be a poll that pops up. Please, if you're interested in any of those offers, just tick the box and we'll get in touch. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Heiko for the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. Good morning, everybody. So as Mario was mentioning, this is going to be covering our Microsoft Azure cost-saving efforts and exercises. The agenda today, we're going to look at breaking down into just an introduction to Azure costs, helping everybody get a baseline understanding of how your costs are structured in Azure, what are some of the common methods that you can use to control your costs, but also where are some common areas that we see in the market where people are losing money on a daily basis. Moving on from there, we are going to touch on a dive into some additional cost-saving activities and efforts, how you can find those opportunities to make savings, but also what common cost control strategies you can look to implement into your environment so you can really fine-tune those ongoing costs. And as Mario mentioned, it's really about unlocking your budget to make as much of your budget available to you for the most expedient implementation of your projects. When we're wrapping up this webinar today, we're going to look at how you can go and take back control. With that, it's going to be a little bit of a demo into the cost analysis tools that are available in Microsoft Azure, but also into the cost alerts and budgets, and also how to make use of the Microsoft Advisor, which is a free tool that's available into you as well. So starting off, just as a baseline, I appreciate people may already have somewhat understanding, but I think it's very important that everybody has a solid baseline understanding of just how your costs are structured in Microsoft Azure. So fundamentally, every single Azure tenancy or Azure environment will have a set of subscriptions that exists underneath it. Now, it could be one subscription, which is quite typical what we see for a lot of people. You may have multiple subscriptions breaking out your environment based on your business requirements. You may break this up regionally. You may break this up by business unit. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Underneath each of your subscriptions, you're going to have any costs that are associated with running Microsoft Azure located underneath that. That's going to be your user licenses, your resource groups, and under your resource groups, that's where things like your virtual machines, Azure Firewall, public IPs, disks, blob storage, etc. are going to exist. So fundamentally, your subscriptions are going to be a target for any and all billing that occurs within Microsoft Azure. You cannot have resources exist without a subscription fundamentally. Now, just to highlight though, and this is going to be brought up again later, anything that exists under subscription can be logged, can be tracked. However, not everything that is associated to billing will exist under a resource group. We'll explain that a little bit more later on. Now, finally, before we move on from here, just as a call out, your subscriptions are broken up into either pay-as-you-go subscriptions, EA agreements with Microsoft, or you working with a MSP that uses what's called a CSP partner license. There's slight differences and implications with each one of those, or slight variations of how those behave, but fundamentally they all function the same way. Now, some of the common cost-saving methods that we see people using in their environments. The first one being reserved instances. So the visual that's up on screen right now shows a virtual machine on the left-hand side. It's a D8 virtual machine. It's got 8 vCPUs, 32 gigs of RAM. And if you're running a pay-as-you-go subscription, you're paying about £470 a month for this machine. However, if you make use of reserved instances for this virtual machine, that cost drops down from £470 a month to £310 a month. However, you are committing to that cost for that virtual machine for the next 3 years. Hybrid benefits is a different approach that you can take if you have your own existing licensing that you want to bring into Microsoft Azure. That helps reduce the running cost of your virtual machines by the fact that you are paying for the licensing of your operating system upfront. Right-sizing and optimizing your virtual machines. Now, right-sizing can be as straightforward as taking an existing D8 virtual machine, a D8 VM, and reducing the size of that virtual machine. You may find that you've deployed a virtual machine at the start of a project, it's been over-spec'd, you're running a few months in, you don't want to be constantly paying for unnecessary resource, so you have the opportunity to downgrade the performance of that virtual machine. It's not that you have to rebuild the machine, you're just dropping down the amount of these virtual CPUs and RAM or memory associated to that machine. One other way that you can also optimize your environment is by running your virtual machines for a particular period of time in the day. So instead of running your virtual machine for 24 hours all day, every day, you could potentially run it only for 12 hours in the day. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the image, the bottom cost, monthly cost for that virtual machine of £235 and 42 pence a month. That cost is if you shut down the machine once every 12 hours, every single day throughout the course of the month. You're only paying for that virtual machine as it's running. I'm going to move on to the next one. Now, another common method is replacing your IaaS instances, that's your infrastructure virtual machines, with PaaS services. That can be things like your file servers. That can be things like replacing databases with Azure DBs. However, you may sit there and think, oh, I'm paying more for the database, or I'm paying more for the storage. If you sit down and calculate the total cost of the resource, including the storage, the management, the monitoring of it, antivirus, etc., 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 you will start to notice things such as Azure Files, for example, that actually works out cheaper to run a 10 terabytes of storage, as an example, or 1 terabyte of storage as Azure Files, as opposed to having two file servers in a redundant pair. The same applies for databases as well. Now, you may be familiar with running databases on virtual machines on a Hyper-V host or a VMware host to really make use of as many VMs and as much compute on a single piece of hardware as possible. Azure has an option for databases called Elastic Pools. So for the visual that's up on screen right now, some organizations may run 3 separate databases, maybe a production database that runs 9 to 5, and 2 additional databases that's used for testing and maybe used for some additional admin outside of those core business hours. The organization on the left has gone ahead and deployed 3 separate individual databases. That's costing them about £292 and 30 pence a month. However, if you take the approach of going to Elastic Pools on the right-hand side, you're running the same total cost of virtual machines, of databases for only £219 a month. So you essentially saved yourself close to £80 just by changing how those virtual machines run. Now, just to call out though, with those Elastic Pool databases, you're still only purchasing the same amount of compute as you need for the most. What you do want to do though is ensure that you are spreading the utilization across the course of the day. So for all intents and purposes, your 250 DTU databases in this example, or if you're more familiar, we can say as an example 4 CPUs, and the smaller ones are using 1 CPU each. Those are going to run really, really well. If you run into contention where you're running multiple databases at the same time, it's not going to stop you from running, but is going to slow down your processing. So you do always have the opportunity to go, my production's running a little bit slow. I can go and pause the databases that are used for dev and for testing during the production hours. Though, again, this is just down to how you're scheduling your tasks to be carried out. Another common cost-saving method is just downgrading your storage performance tier. While some organizations may decide to run a P10 disk, premium disks across the board, you may find that some, again, testing databases or some light touch servers don't actually need a premium disk, don't need a premium SSD running. They could run just perfectly fine on a lower tier drive. So dropping from a P to an E, as per the image on the far right, that will take your premium disk costing you £18 a month down to only cost you £8.55 a month. Now, it may seem like not a big deal. However, what we see time and time again is that storage is one of the largest costs in any organization's overall Azure costs. So really, in this instance, you look after the pennies, then the pounds will come. Another item to consider as well is where you deploy your resources in Microsoft Azure. Sure, you'll have people tell you that it's better to deploy resources closer. We want to run all our resources in a single region. What you may want to take into consideration though is, do you really need those resources in the same geographic region? Do you need them all in the same country? If not, you may want to look to deploying some of those resources out into separate regions. Maybe keep your production workloads within Europe, within the UK, keep it in UK South, UK West, However, your development resources, push those out out of the country. Find a region that it's going to be cheaper for you to run. The graphic at the bottom is showing what the hourly cost is on average for virtual machines based on the geographic region. So currently Brazil Southwest is the most expensive, costing just over £2.50 an hour, sorry, $2.50 an hour to run a virtual machine on average, whereas Central India is running just over $1 an hour for the same average of virtual machines. It is possible to connect your virtual machines in your network across the geographic regions you got as you're peering to make use of that. So it's not a massive undertaking just to redeploy some resources out to a different geographic region. Another common cost-saving method is customers making full use of their Office 365 and Microsoft 365 licenses. Now, you may have some organizations that are paying separately for database management systems. They're paying separate costs for antivirus solutions, another separate cost for endpoint management solutions. Leveraging your E3 and E5 licenses, you can actually cover off a lot, if not all, of your current IT needs just by replacing some of those existing services with Microsoft offerings as well. Take in consideration, though, that Microsoft is typically going to deliver well over 80% of what your requirements are. There are going to be better products out there in your particular niche use case that may provide over and above what Microsoft provides. But you need to ask yourself, really, as an organization, are you benefiting from those additional niche capabilities? Would you not be better off saving some of that money on a monthly cost and shifting that budget over to another project? It's not just about leveraging your M365 capabilities. It's also being intelligent with your Office 365 licensing. Not every single user needs to have an E3 license. Not every single user needs to have an E5 license. Microsoft do have additional licensing capabilities for people like frontline workers. We have customers that have staff who are traveling the countryside, and all they work with is a mobile phone and an iPad. And that's it, nothing else. Those users have no requirement for an E3 or an E5 license. In those cases, we start talking to them about frontline licenses, your F1 license, your F3 license, your F5 license. They may have additional licensing requirements for products such as enterprise management security or the EMS licensing. But it's not necessary that they have to have an entire E3 or E5 license with all these capabilities for users who just use their mobile device on a day-to-day basis. Now, we're going to take a moment and just see if there's any questions anybody wants to ask on what we've discussed so far before we start going into some of the common cost things. Don't believe there have been any questions so far. So that, I think, let's resume. So we're going to step through now the next few slides on what we've seen as common cost sinks environments, things that you can look out for, that you can amend, things that you can think about on your day-to-day running of the environment. Now, I've mentioned right-sizing virtual machines before, and I'm going to touch on this again because it is a very important point to make note of. Oversizing your virtual machines. Not all virtual machines are the same. Not every 8 virtual CPUs is the same as every other 8 virtual CPUs. In the visual that you have on screen right now, we're going from left to right. You can see one virtual machine has 64 gigs of RAM. That's running 8 virtual CPUs. The next one is again running 8 virtual CPUs, but only 16 gigs of RAM. And then finally, the last one's running only 32 gigs of RAM. You can see how the cost shifts going from left to right. But what you also notice is that the F8, as an example, runs 16 gigs of RAM, but ends up costing more than the virtual machine with 32 gigs of RAM. This is down to the performance requirement of that virtual machine. So just because you need more memory doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be fine with slow performing memory. So it really does take some time and effort to really consider what it is that you require. But at the same time, if you don't need more you don't really want to be paying for more. So moving on from there, idle virtual machines. You may have a database server that's running, again, runs 9 to 5, doesn't function outside of business hours. You may want to consider shutting off that virtual machine outside of those core business hours. So again, with the visual on screen, this D8 virtual machine, that's running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and you're paying £470 a month for that virtual machine. If you shut down that virtual machine outside of your core hours, shut it down for 12 hours a day, set up a schedule, shut it down and turn it on automatically. As soon as you have that virtual machine back up and running and shutting down and turning on again, you're saving up, you're reducing your cost from £470 a month down to £235 a month for that virtual machine. This doesn't just apply for database machines, by the way. This may apply for any and all virtual machines on your Azure environment. Your not really best practice, but again, but branching out a little bit more, you may have redundant web servers that are running your internal websites. You may not need that redundancy for a static website outside your business hours. You may not need all the redundancy in the world outside of those business hours. So it may be worthwhile to consider what applications and what servers and services you can shut down outside of those core hours. Because fundamentally, if you're not making use of the virtual machine, you don't really want to be paying for it. Disks. As mentioned, in some instances, some customer environments, their storage can account for 50% or over 50% of their monthly cost for Microsoft Azure. As an example here, this is a typical scenario that we have seen for some organizations we've engaged with. They may have a single virtual machine. So in this example, it's a domain controller. That domain controller has one disk associated with it. Great. On budget, on paper, it costs you £19 a month. What we see in practice happening is that operation teams get involved. They might make a backup to test a piece of work. They may clone the virtual machine again for another separate piece of work. There may be an incident and the machine's been recovered, but they've kept the disk just in case and someone's forgotten to clean it up. Or somebody's gone and created a snapshot of that virtual machine. Each one of these disks costs another £18 a month. And that's these snapshots. Yeah, sure, they only cost £1 a month, but that cost adds up. In this instance, it's only 10 gigs that you're paying £1.20 of that disk. But as mentioned, these costs do ramp up. You expand this across a large organization, you have 25 servers, suddenly the problem just starts growing exponentially, and it becomes a really tedious effort at times to work through the environment, make sure you're getting rid of the right disks, that you're not removing the wrong disks accidentally, but just taking the time and effort to go and do that activity does sometimes put people off that, yeah, we'll just do it later, but you can end up paying £200, £300, £400, £500 a month in some cases just on disks that, again, you're not making use of. Another common cost sink is just the storing of data in general. Separate from disks, there's blob storage. Now, blob storage exists in different tiers. You have a hot, a cool, a cold, and an archive tier. What we see sometimes is customers will go and create a backup, and they'll store that backup into the hot storage tier. And they will leave that backup there, and they will never move it. They're paying £156 a month for 10 terabytes of storage. What I've got visually represented here is how that cost drops down going from each tier. There's a process called lifecycle management in Microsoft Azure that allows you to move data from one storage tier down to another one based on a period of time. There are backup tools like Veeam that allow you to, on schedule, move data from the hot storage tier to the cool storage tier, or to the cold storage tier, and then move it down to the cold storage tier from the cool tier. And as you can see, in each instance, with each hop, that monthly cost reduces again and again and again. Just as a word of warning, though, when it comes to the archive tier, that at that point in time, you really only want data that you're very rarely going to touch existing there, because it does take time and effort and a physical request to get that storage out of there. Moving on from that, however, there's an additional consideration, is Azure Files. Now, I mentioned Azure Files, great tool, it's a great product to replace your file servers, but again, a common scenario that we see people doing is they will go and create an Azure file, they'll assign 1 terabyte of storage to that, but they'll only use 250 gigs of that. You might think, well, I'm paying for what I use. True, but you're actually paying what you're allocated. So you're paying £250 for 250 gigs, you're paying £139 a month. That's steeply expensive. Whereas again, in another instance, another Azure Files instance, you've got a 750 gig that you're using, and you're paying the same amount for that. So Azure Files does allow you to scale up and scale down the amount of storage that you're using. Just take consideration though, if you scale it up and you're not using it, you're paying for the allocation and you're wasting your funds again. So you want to be hot on that and just keep an eye on how much you're actually allocating for your storage. The same logic applies for your disks as well. Now, P10 disk is P10 disk is about 128 gigs worth of storage. If you're using 100 gigs of that, and you're only assigning 100 gigs of that, you're throwing away that 28 gigs worth of storage. Realistically, it's about 15 to 20 gigs. You want to make sure that you're using as much of your storage as possible, because there's no point having 5 disks using 100 gigs of that 128, and now you have to buy a 6th disk. That's going to cost you again because you're not using that additional storage available to you. But yeah, let's move on to another common cost sink, virtual network gateways, VPNs. Everybody loves a good VPN. Everybody sets up a VPN. I've got a piece of work to do. I need to connect quickly. I'll just spin up a VPN quickly. I'll go for a cheap tier. I'll go for the VPN Gateway 1. The problem is, though, what some people tend to do time and time again is they will create multiple gateways. And each one of those is going to run you £110 a month for those gateways. Or you may have some teams going, hey, we're going to save some costs and we're going to deploy two virtual network gateways. We're going to do the cheap tier. We're going to have resilience because we're going to have 2 of those. Except the fact, though, that you could just replace it with an AZ gateway, a singular one. That's going to allow you to have a resilient gateway and it's going to end up saving you money. Now, in this instance, not too much money that you're saving, but at the end of the day, it does tend to add up. So keeping an eye out for those virtual network gateways and really ask yourself the question, do we need that VPN gateway? Do we need 3 of them? Do we need 5 of them? Can we just remove some of them? Can we replace some of those gateways with services like Azure Bastion or Azure Virtual Desktops, or even just giving them console access to the Azure portal, just to remove the requirement for those VPNs? Some organizations will set up a VPN gateway for the course of a project to go out to a contractor. Hey, guess what? Your project budget has now just got an unnecessary £110 added onto that, and you don't know if that's necessarily going to go away at the end of the project because someone might forget to remove it. As mentioned, there are other services you can use to enable that connectivity. I'm banging on this one, the Office 365 license usage and the M365 benefits. Again, we see time and time again that people have gone down the route of setting up Office 365, getting their email migrated, they're paying for the Office 365 licenses, they're paying for the Microsoft 365 licenses, but they're not using the capabilities associated with it. And then they're paying for all the additional services that they require. That, at the end of the day, again, is just a waste of your budget. You really want to sit down and have a think about and really understand what it is that's available to you on those Microsoft 365 license tiers when you buy an E3, a Business Premium, or an E5. You really want to understand, does every user in your organization need an Office 365 license? Do they need an E3 license? Do your contractors need a license? Honestly, no. You could just guest invite those contractors, or if you're engaging with a third party, guest invite those users into your organization. Let them use their own license. You don't need to supply them a license every single time you're engaging with a new external party. guest invites really are a boon for collaborating with other organizations. And if you're assigning Office 365 licenses today to those external third parties and you're creating brand new accounts for them, spending IT time and effort to do that, stop. Get familiar with the process for guest invites. If you need some help with that, we're able to come in and assist with that. Now, when we're talking about the M365 benefits, that's going to cover things like your endpoint management, your user license control for your Office products, your documentation libraries with Microsoft SharePoint, email control, email security, data loss prevention for your documentation and your email, collaboration tools with things like Microsoft Teams. Hey, replace your PBX, replace your telephony system with the Microsoft Teams license that enables telephony via Teams. And wrap that all up in the Microsoft security offering, which frankly does have some of the best endpoint security on the market to date. And again, that's all included in those E3, E5 licenses. So
just before you move on, Heiko, there's just a quick question, and whilst we're on the topic of licensing. So Richard has asked around Azure hybrid rights, and what does that mean if you own a 2022 data center license? So look, I can quickly cover that one. If you have a Windows Server standard or a Windows Server data center license, they must have active software assurance on them, at which point you are allowed to use that option in Azure, which is called hybrid rights. That does significantly, as Heiko showed, reduce the cost of the virtual machine, because you're essentially not paying for the license. And actually, if you have a look in the Azure calculator, you'll see that a big portion of the cost of the machines is actually that Windows license. There's just two things to consider with hybrid rights. If it's a server edition license, you can only use it either on-prem or in Azure. If it's a data center edition license, you are allowed to use it simultaneously in both Azure and on-premise. The only caveat is it must be a minimum of an 8-core license, and you will have to do the annual declarations to Microsoft to ensure that you're not overspending in terms of your license allocation, both in Azure and on-prem. So hopefully that helps, Richard. If there's any follow-up questions, please do post them in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. So let's continue about how do you actually find these cost-saving opportunities? Where do you find the nuggets? So as Mario had mentioned, the Azure Cost Calculator, it's a really good, useful tool to help you understand how much you are potentially going to be spending on Azure before you just pull the trigger and deploy your resources. It will give you the opportunity to figure out your license costs based on what kind of compute you're using, how much storage you're going to assign, are you going to back it up, are you going to do any DR with that resource, are you going to do reserved instances, are you going to use the hybrid benefit or not. Plug all that data into that portal, and it will give you a pretty near quote as to what you would be expected to pay month on month within your Microsoft Azure environment. It's also a really good way to try and wrap your head around how much, if you are actually paying the right amount for what you have today. So you may sit there and think, oh man, I'm paying about 150 grand a month for my Azure environment, just on the resources alone. You go into the Azure cost calculator, you put in the type of virtual machines you have, how much storage you have. You may sit there and go, well, hang on a second. I'm only supposed to be paying about 90K or 100K. What's going on here? That's going to allow you to realize that, hey, something's not right. I may have unused resources. I may have overcommitted on something. I may have something wrong in my environment. And that's going to allow you to start drilling in. But moving on from that, there's also the Azure Advisor. This is a tool that exists in Azure today. It's available on your portal. It's constantly running. You don't have to sign up for it. All you got to do is go into your Azure portal and type in the search bar, Azure Advisor or Advisor. Even if you go into your subscription, it's bang right there available for you to look at. Azure Advisor is going to give you 5 groups of recommendations. They're going to be looking at security, performance. They're going to look at kind of essentially operational best practices, and they're going to look at costs. And the final one has actually just escaped me. No, I think it's just the 4. The costs piece is going to be an ongoing, constant review of your environment to highlight right-sizing opportunities for you, to highlight where your virtual machines may be over-provisioned, where they may be under-provisioned, where you may need to make your machines bigger, where you may make savings by right-sizing your virtual machines. We're going to touch on that briefly towards the end of it, but it is, if you're going to write anything down today, Azure Advisor is probably the one thing you want to take a note of and get yourself familiar with that, because that guarantee you will save you money at the end of the day. Finally, moving on then, it's the Azure Cost Management and Billing module. Now, just a caveat to put on this, it is available and it is used for every single Microsoft Azure customer and every single Microsoft Azure environment. However, historically, the billing modules were disabled for some customers. Some CSPs have the option to choose to enable it or disable it. We've opted that it's better to be open with our customers, so we have it enabled by default, that you may need to go ask your service provider to enable that for you. That in some cases, if you're still somehow running on an older Azure subscription, you will need to get your service provider to upgrade your license. It doesn't cost anything extra to upgrade it. It is just an administrative task. It's something you're just going to need to ask for, and you may need to just have, it may be enabled already. You just need to ask for the permission to view it as well. That Azure Cost Management Billing is really going to help you analyze where your expenditures are in your environment. Is going to give you a really good breakdown as to where you are spending money in Azure. I'm breaking that out into daily costs and monthly costs and just an aggregate of your overall costs for a period of time. Moving on from that, your resource tagging capabilities. Now, some people may use resource tagging just for a couple of admin notes here and there as they go along. Fundamentally, your resource tagging is going to help you to logically structure what your expenses are against each of your Azure resources. You can't tag everything, and we're going to touch on the why later. But fundamentally, you want to tag things like your virtual machines, your public IP addresses, your network cards, Azure firewalls, virtual machines, storage, general computing pieces. And the reasoning behind that is when it comes to your invoice at the end of the month, you're able to look at every single line item that you have, and you can see all the tags associated with each one of those. When you're sitting there at 10 o'clock in the evening, pulling your hair out and trying to put together an accurate cost report of your Azure environment for the board, by having those tags in there, it's going to save your life, and it's going to make you a lot happier at the end of the day, because you can just start using Excel to filter that as much as you need. Finally, Azure policies. Now, this is starting to creep into taking back control of your environment. Azure policies has a couple of things associated with it. It comes often up with compliance, but one of the things that's great for controlling your costs is using it to restrict the type of resources that you deploy and the type of regions you deploy into. If you have no services running in India, as an example, or let's go Brazil. As mentioned, Brazil's most expensive environment to run your virtual machines. You can block every other geographic region to deploy into except your specific geographic regions that you operate in. On top of that, you can put restrictions in place, such as enforcing that only certain types of virtual machines can be used, only certain types of geographical locations can be deployed into, and as an enforcement, everything needs to be tagged with specific tags when it gets deployed. That way, it's not a case of you're going to sit there and spend time and effort putting it in for the first time and then nobody uses it. You're using the policies to enforce that going forward, so that you know when you pull up that next set of reports, everything's going to be in there as you expect. That's going to lead on to Azure tools in general. I recommend everybody has a look at this slide in particular. This deck is going to go out at the end of this, so take a screenshot or wait for the slide deck to come out. These are all the tools that are available to you in Microsoft Azure to help you understand your costs, to control your costs, and to help you generate those reports. They're broken up into what's available on the Azure portal, what exists under the Azure Cost Management Billing module. Again, that's on the Azure portal. Reports that you can pull out via Power BI. Nice thing of Power BI is you can set up a dashboard and use that as an ongoing status for what your overall costs are. So instead of having to manually run a report once a month, You can pull that report out on a schedule and not have to put too much thought into it after you've done it the first time. And then finally, when it comes to Azure policy, you can use that for your budget control. You can control the spending on a single resource across multiple resources and enforcing metadata on those resources. Are there any questions so far before we move into common cost control strategies?
Heiko, just to jump in very quickly, appreciate it's 11:15 now. We're supposed to kind of finish at 10:45. There's a little bit more to go. If people can stay on, that's brilliant. There's some really good stuff coming from Heiko. But if not, then we'll be sending round the slides and the recording afterwards, and can also follow up around the kind of professional service engagements that Mario mentioned earlier on.
Okay. So the common cost control strategies, reserved instances, as mentioned before, is probably the biggest one to make use of. This is just a mock-up of a typical Azure environment. You have your Active Directory servers, you have AD Connect, you have a couple of application servers, you may have Citrix environment in there as well, some file servers and application servers and databases. If you're paying monthly for this environment, you're paying about £2,000 a month. If you're reserving it for a year, all the compute, it drops down to $1,700 a month. If you drop a reserve for 3 years, that drops by a further £300 a month. This is typically an approach you'll take for services that are running 24/7 that make up the core of your environment. But do make note that this does not include every single cost when you reserve a virtual machine. Just to flag though, when you reserve virtual machines, you're not reserving the machine itself, you're reserving the family or the type of virtual machine. So as per the image below, if you have a D8 virtual machine and you don't need that anymore, you can replace that with 2 D4 machines. If you don't need those D4 machines, you can replace that one D4 machine with 2 D2 machines. It's based on the amount of compute and CPUs available to that family that reservations work on. Another common cost control strategy, and this helps with the reporting and management, is breaking up resources into multiple different subscriptions. So in this example, we have your core production environment costs us £168 a month. UAT and DevOps costs £84 and £32 a month. The virtual desktop subscription is quite bloated, £1,650 a month. And then finally, our line of business application, that it costs us £252 a month. The reason we break it up like this is it's going to allow you to very quickly identify where your expenditure is going, where the bulk of your budget's going. But also when it comes to anomalies and handling those anomalies, it's very easy then to drill down where those anomalies are coming from. Because right now, if you had a single subscription, this would cost you £2,167 a month. It would take you a lot of time and effort to find where that additional £300-400 a month is coming from. Budgets and cost alerts is probably one of the biggest saving graces that you would have in your environment. That is fundamentally going to allow you to proactively control and be aware of when you're going over budget or when you're forecasting to be over budget. Somebody in IT accidentally deploys a machine that's too large and you don't have controls to prevent that. Suddenly your bill is forecasted to go £1,000 over budget. You're going to get an alert within a 12 to 24 hour period that has exceeded the budget on forecast, and that can send out notifications to your team about that. However, an additional approach that you can take is you can automate that entire process of how you handle that. So for some resources, you can take the approach just to shut down all the virtual machines within a subscription or within a resource group using an automation account, using a runbook, or go the nuclear option and just delete everything in that resource group to make sure that you're not spending a penny more than what you need to. As mentioned, that is very much the nuclear approach. Finally, just touching on tagging once more. Here's an example of what you would have if you made use of tagging. Be aware, this would look very different in a real world scenario, but fundamentally, if you tagged for your finance team, you can filter in a CSV everything that is associated to the costs of running finance, everything that may be associated to individual stores, and then finally, all costs associated to your internal IT or your core IT requirements. How do you actually go about saving your costs? So we've broken this up from easy, medium to hard. Fundamentally, the easiest approach is enabling those budgets, reserving your compute costs, remove those unused resources, and understand what your current expenditure looks like by using the billing module, and then finally tagging your resources. All these are very low intrusive and non-disruptive to your environment. What takes more effort though is resizing virtual machines or adjusting your storage tiers. Each one of these will have to have an additional piece of work associated with it, and you may need to have further discussions internally how you handle this. What becomes then a little bit more difficult though, but still worth it, is migrating your services over to PaaS, such as replacing your database virtual machines with an elastic pool, or replacing your services with Office 365 offerings, or finally shutting down resources outside of your core hours. Again, you need to do a bit of a balancing act for that. We're coming up to the demo, where we're just going to touch briefly on the cost analysis, alerts, budgets, and whatever's presented, or whatever else is presented here. The main one we're going to focus on is the cost analysis tool. So I know we're short on time. I'm going to move on into that one. So why is this? Here we go. All right. So this is the billing module that you'll have available to you under subscription. You can see what the spending rate is and forecast for the environment within the middle, and you can see a breakdown of your cost by your resources. On the image on the right-hand side, that is showing your most expensive resources, essentially your top 4 resources that's running in your environment. Further to that as well, you can also see the number of products that you have running within your environment down here. What we're going to look into and drill into for the cost analysis is this piece here. Takes a second. Here we go. So, as you can see here in this image, this may look confusing. It's not once you get an understanding of this. Fundamentally, what this is showing is in solid green what you're actually spending in this period of time. So this is for September 2023. In this environment, we're spending £2,400 a month. We're forecasted to go up to £6,698.92. However, our budget is £6,435 at this point in time. An alert would have gone out to make us aware that, hey, we're on track to exceed the budget. We can start seeing some breakdowns here of the virtual machines, the storage, the backup, where these costs are coming from for this environment. So if I resume this. So we can see here that towards the end of the month, we're going to start exceeding our budget, and we're going to go into overages. That's going to cost us about £200 extra a month, or at the end of the month. Now, to help me understand what's going on with my expenditures, I can break this out into my daily expenditures. So I can start having a look at how much, on average, the entire environment is costing me day to day. So I can see here that on average, I'm spending £212 a day, which is exceeding my budget at this point in time. If I go click into virtual machine storage or backup at the bottom, that will show me my virtual machine costs for each one of those, but I can see that on average I'm paying £10 extra a month. What I'm going to want to do though is I want to try and track down where this started. So I'm going to look at this over the quarter. Now I can see that from the 1st of July, I am under budget, which is great, but coming around to the 13th of July, I seem to be consistently going over budget. I went a little bit over budget again between the 21st and 31st, but then came back down and again going back over. So I'm going to want to have a look around here to see what changes have been introduced into my environment at that point in time. Now, without going into it right now, due to lack of time, you could take the extra steps and look at your virtual machine costs, look at your storage costs, look at your backup costs. Just click into each one of those at the bottom to see what those monthly costs are and where that excess expenditure has come from. Now, if this was broken up into separate subscriptions, it would make it a lot easier to track down where this excess cost has come from. Again, you can break this up into resources or resource groups just to get a bit of further clarification as to where your expenditure is going. At this point in time, though, we're going to move on to, is this the next slide? We're going to have a look at a larger period. So we're looking at September 22nd to August 23rd. We're switching this from the line graph to a column, and we're going to look at our monthly expenditure for this environment. You can see here that back in September, we were paying approximately just under £6,000. October went over, November, we crept back down, and February, we went back down again. But again, we're gradually starting to creep up again. So by making use of this tool is really going to help you to keep control of your environment and find those costs that are spiraling out of control before they become an issue, before you're sitting there with an extra 10K bill that you're not aware of. Let's move on. The Azure Advisor, I highly recommend. Now, as you saw in the video, it's under cost management. You have the alerts and budgets, and you have the advisor recommendations as well. The advisor recommendations, as mentioned, is running continuously on your environment. That is going to give you things. In this instance, we've got potential $25,000 to save per year, and that's broken down based on right sizing the virtual machines, maybe changing to a saving plan, or alternatively purchasing reserved instances. Do keep in mind though, just because it says it's $25,000 doesn't mean that we're guaranteed to save $25,000. Realistically, we're going to save, in this instance, about $10,000 plus the 1,400, because I know that these three here are not compatible with one another. Now, in the example of the right sizing of virtual machines, it makes recommendations that, well, sorry, the reserved instances, that for D2 virtual machines, I just need one reservation, and that's going to save me $598 a year. And that's going to repeat for the number of virtual machines in each environment going down. I think we will move on to wrapping up. So just some key takeaways that I want you to walk away with. The cost analysis tool, it's available. Ask for it. Get into it. Get familiar with it. It's really going to help you understand where your expenditure is going. The cost alerts are going to be the key to preventing your accidental expenditures. As your policies, you're going to use those to control where you're deploying resources and what size of resources you're deploying. You don't need that 16 CPU virtual machine that's got a massive graphics card associated with it or a dedicated host. So you might as well exclude that from the available resources so you avoid anyone doing that by accident. Your budget alerts, you can keep that as simple as just sending an email notification out to your team, to your help desk, getting that logged as a ticket, taking a further step to shutting down those virtual machines automatically, or going the nuclear approach and deleting all the resources within a resource group or even a subscription. If you're making use of virtual desktops, one of the most efficient ways we've seen to run them is to run them as individual virtual machines rather than hosted pools. It is counterintuitive. However, when it comes to management of workloads, it becomes a lot easier to power off and power on virtual machines, scale that usage up and down if there's only one user running on that virtual machine. Because if you have a machine built for 25 users and one user is on it, you can't shut down that very expensive VM until that user gets off. And finally, not every user needs an E3 license or an E5 license. Take the time, look at what they actually need, and you'll be able to break that out into your teams, and from there you can start making further cost savings. So just to wrap up then, Dave.
Thanks, Heiko. Before we go on to the questions, there's a couple in the chat. Feel free to add any more in there. We're just going to throw up a quick poll on the screen, David, if you wouldn't mind doing that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if anybody would like to make use of the health check, please do let us know. Okay, we'll just give a few seconds for everybody to complete that. Right, should we move on to the questions? Heiko, there's two questions on there, probably both for yourself. You happy to take them?
Sure. That's, I am not seeing the questions currently, Mario, if you'd be so kind.
Yep, no problem. So the first one is, what are your thoughts on spot VMs in contributing to cost savings?
So spot virtual machines, they are going to provide you some cost savings, and it is useful to make use of that in an environment where you can be quite flexible. But if you have a traditional IT environment that is quite rigid in its operations, I may not want to look at making use of a spot virtual machine. I probably still look down the route of doing a reserved instance or running a normal virtual machine and then just shutting that down as and when can be. It is a bit of a niche use case in some instances.
Okay. And the last question, unless anybody else wants to add any more in, was could you just talk about or give a little bit more detail around the Azure saving plans?
Sure. So while a lot of people are familiar with the reserved instances, that's the common approach to go down. Microsoft is starting to now push more and more the saving plans. The idea behind the saving plans is that you are committing to an hourly compute cost. So you're not running just purely a set of virtual machines, you're committing to an ongoing expenditure for your environment. There is some flexibility in that where you may run a little bit more or a little bit less. The idea is that Microsoft will give you a fairly hefty discount. And as we saw in the visual earlier, if I go back to that, as a comparison, you can see here that going down the route of a saving plan for this environment would have saved us $10,600 US, but reserving the instances would have given us a saving of $10,200. The problem that I find with the saving plan is it's again, you are committing to that hourly compute cost regardless of your machines are up or down. If for any point in time you need to shut down a virtual machine, you want to have a look at avoiding the saving plan and avoiding the reserved instances if you're not going to run it for 70% of the time. I'm thumb sucking that, but if the majority of the time the virtual machine is running, you want to look at saving plans and reserved instances. If it is, I think maybe if I phrase it like this, for reserved instances, you're picking and choosing, again, a type of family of virtual machines. If you are running a large, varying series of families of virtual machines across your estate, you may want to have a look then instead at using the saving plan, as that is going to probably give you a more consistent expenditure over the course of the next year, or however long that you use that saving plan.
I think that you brought up a really good point there as well that I think is probably worth throwing in from me, is the misconception around reserved instances. A lot of people think that they are reserving a specific virtual machine. You're not. You're reserving a type of machine. So, if you've got 10 D series, D2, 3, D2S machines, you reserve 5 of them. That can be any of those 5. So if you then decide, I need to change a couple of those machines, as long as you've still got at least 5 in your environment, then they're covered under reserved instances. So again, think about what type of machines you're using, and when you're using reserved instances, you can still have a bit of flexibility to change those machines later, providing you've got enough of that type to then cover the amount that you've reserved.
I think one additional thing to add in there, when you're buying a reservation, you're reserving that family in that data center. If your workload is frequently using different sized virtual machines and you're moving your data centers all around, say you have a workload that you may be running UK South and then you're running UK West, saving plan is going to be the better option for you, because as soon as you move those workloads from one region to another, you have to reapply for your reservation. So if we go back to 2018, there was a problem with capacity in UK South data center. If you had reserved instances in UK South and you powered on your virtual machines in UK West, you did not save money. You spent more money at that point, because you were then paying for the pay-as-you-go rate in UK West, because your reservation does not necessarily carry over to different geographical regions. But the idea behind saving plans is that will carry over to alternative geographic locations. Does that help answer the question?
Think so.
All right.
Brilliant.
Any other last questions?
I think that's it on the questions front. So we'll close the webinar now. We will follow up. If anybody does have any questions, or you want to have a call with Heiko, or for us to come in and have a chat, then please do reach out. The team will reach out to you guys after this webinar. And yeah, great to see that so many of you have taken us up on the 365 optimizations and Azure health checks. We very much look forward to being able to add some value and offering some help there. Thank you all, and yeah, look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Take care and goodbye.